Every piece of paper money you have ever held carries a command. Not a suggestion, not a promise, a command. It is printed so plainly that most people never question it. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Those words are not decoration, they are not tradition, they are not symbolic. They are power. They mean that the government can decide what counts as money and force everyone else to accept it. That idea feels normal today. It wasn't always. In fact, for most of American history, it was unthinkable. Because money used to be property. A dollar wasn't an opinion. It wasn't policy. It wasn't trust. It was metal. Gold or silver, weighed, measured, and owned outright. If you held it, no one could change what it was worth with a vote or a ruling. If someone owed you money, they owed you something real, something the law couldn't redefine later. That certainty did not disappear gradually. It was shattered in a single moment of national panic. In 1862, the United States was fighting for its life. The Civil War was not only the bloodiest conflict in American history, it was the most expensive. The Union was spending more than $1 million a day. Armies had to be paid, weapons had to be purchased, railroads had to be maintained, and the war dragged on far longer than anyone expected. Then the gold disappeared. Banks stopped lending coin. Citizens hoarded what little metal remained. Foreign creditors demanded brutal interest rates if they would lend at all. The Treasury faced a terrifying reality. The government was running out of money in the middle of an existential war. If soldiers could not be paid, the Union would collapse, not from defeat on the battlefield, but from bankruptcy. The responsibility for preventing that collapse fell on one man. Salmon P. Chase was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury. He was not a financial radical. He was a constitutional conservative, a firm believer in hard money. Chase believed paper currency was dangerous, dishonest, and incompatible with the Constitution. Chase believed money meant gold and silver, nothing else. But war does not negotiate with principles. Chase faced an impossible choice: follow the Constitution as he understood it and allow the Union to default, or violate his own beliefs to save the country. So he did something extraordinary. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. For the first time in American history, the federal government printed paper money that could not be redeemed for gold or silver. No metal backing, no conversion guarantee, just ink, paper, and law. These notes became known as greenbacks, but printing them was only half the decision. The real revolution came with a single sentence. The law declared that these paper notes were legal tender for all debts, public and private. That meant creditors were forced by law to accept them, even for contracts that had been written under a gold standard. A debt promised in gold could now be paid in paper. This was not reform, it was a fundamental rewriting of what money was. The greenbacks worked at first. Soldiers were paid. The government kept operating. The Union survived. But almost immediately, the cost of this decision became clear. The greenbacks fell in value. By 1863, a paper dollar was roughly half a gold dollar. And with that drop, something unprecedented happened. Without rewriting a single contract, without passing a single additional law, the government had changed the outcome of every debt in the country. If you were a debtor, it was a gift. If you were a creditor, it was confiscation. A loan made in real money was being repaid with cheaper paper. Wealth did not disappear. It was transferred, quietly, legally, instantly. Bankers, bondholders, and lenders were furious. They did not see inflation. They saw theft sanctioned by Congress. And they turned to the last institution that could stop it, the Supreme Court. The Constitution offered no easy answer. It clearly prohibited the states from making anything but gold and silver legal tender. But when it came to the federal government, the text was silent.
That silence became the most dangerous word in American law.
Did silence mean the power did not exist? Or did it mean the power was unlimited? If Congress could force citizens to accept paper money, then money itself was no longer property. It was obedience. And someone had to decide whether that was constitutional. That decision would fall to the Supreme Court. And sitting at the center of the court was a man with a personal stake in the outcome. Salmon P. Chase was no longer Treasury Secretary. He was now Chief Justice of the United States. The man who had created the greenbacks was about to judge their legality. The case that brought the issue before the court did not look historic. It was a simple contract dispute, a debt signed before the Legal Tender Act, when a dollar meant gold. After the war, the debtor tried to repay it with greenbacks. The creditor refused. The question was deceptively simple. Can the government change the meaning of a promise after it has been made? If the answer was yes, then contracts were no longer protected from political power. If the answer was no, then the greenbacks and the government's financial survival were at risk. In 1870, the Supreme Court delivered its answer. By a narrow margin, the court ruled against the government. The Legal Tender Act, it said, could not constitutionally apply to debts created before it existed. Forcing creditors to accept depreciated paper violated the Fifth Amendment. It stripped property without compensation. It broke the spirit of the Constitution. The opinion was written by Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. The man who had authorized paper money had just tried to destroy it. It was an astonishing act of judicial restraint. Chase argued that emergencies did not erase constitutional limits. War justified many actions, but not the rewriting of private contracts after the fact. For supporters of hard money, it was a triumph. For the Treasury, it was a disaster. The ruling placed hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts into legal uncertainty. If creditors could suddenly demand gold, the government itself might be unable to pay its war debts. Markets froze. Confidence wavered. The financial system trembled. The war was over, but the bill remained unpaid. And that was when the president decided the court had gone too far. President Ulysses S. Grant understood power differently than judges did. He had commanded armies. He had watched men die waiting for supplies that arrived too late. He had seen what happens when institutions fail under pressure. To Grant, the Supreme Court's ruling was not a thoughtful constitutional disagreement. It was a threat. If the court's decision stood, the government's ability to finance itself in crisis would be crippled forever. The greenbacks would be neutered. War debts would explode in value. Confidence in federal credit would collapse. And Grant noticed something crucial. The Supreme Court was not at full strength. 2 seats were vacant. One justice had retired. Another seat existed because Congress had recently increased the size of the court. Those seats were empty at the exact moment the greenbacks were declared unconstitutional. Grant acted immediately. On the very day the decision was announced, he nominated 2 new justices. Both men were known supporters of strong federal authority. Both were sympathetic to the Legal Tender Acts. The speed and precision of the move left no doubt about its purpose. Critics didn't mince words. They called it a court coup. Grant was accused of packing the court to reverse a decision he disliked, of manipulating judicial independence to preserve government power, of turning the Supreme Court into an instrument of executive survival. Grant didn't deny it. From his perspective, the court had endangered the nation. And when survival was at stake, precedent mattered less than outcomes. The Senate confirmed both nominees quickly. And then something almost unheard of happened. The government asked the Supreme Court to reconsider the same constitutional question it had just decided. This was a direct challenge to stare decisis, the principle that legal decisions should stand to preserve stability. If rulings could be overturned simply by changing who sat on the bench, then law itself became fluid, political, conditional. Under normal circumstances, the court would have refused. These were not normal circumstances. The court agreed to hear the issue again. The case chosen for this confrontation did not look historic. It did not involve millions of dollars or sweeping legislation. It involved sheep.
During the war, livestock in Texas had been seized and sold. After the war, the original owner sued for compensation. The court ruled she was owed payment. The only question was how that payment would be made: gold or greenbacks. Under the previous ruling, the answer was gold. Under a reversed ruling, paper would suffice. A dispute over livestock became the stage on which the Supreme Court would redefine money itself. When the court issued its new decision in 1871, the result was unmistakable. The majority flipped. The Legal Tender Acts were upheld retroactively and prospectively. Paper money was constitutional. Creditors could be compelled to accept it. The previous ruling was overruled. The opinion was written by one of Grant's new appointees, and the reasoning marked a complete philosophical break from the past. The justice argued that the Constitution was not a suicide pact. A government, he said, must possess the inherent power to preserve its own existence. If the state could raise armies, wage war, and borrow money, it must also have the authority to determine what counts as money in an emergency. The necessary and proper clause became the foundation of this logic. Congress did not need explicit permission to choose the tools required to achieve legitimate ends. If issuing paper money was necessary to save the Union, then it was constitutional. But the opinion went further, much further. The court rejected the idea that money needed intrinsic value. Gold and silver, it argued, were not money because of nature. They were money because the law said they were acceptable for payment. Value, in other words, was not physical. It was legal. There was no eternal standard of value, no natural anchor, only what the sovereign declared acceptable for settling debts. If Congress said paper was money, then paper was money. Creditors, the court argued, accepted the risk of currency change when they signed contracts. Inflation was not confiscation. It was history unfolding. With that logic, centuries of monetary thought collapsed. Money stopped being a thing. It became a rule. The dissent was furious. Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase now found himself on the losing side. He accused the court of granting Congress a power the framers had explicitly rejected. He warned that allowing paper money meant legalized plunder, that inflation was simply theft conducted through law. Chase argued that the Constitution had been designed specifically to prevent this kind of power, that the founders had stripped the federal government of the ability to issue paper money precisely because of its abuse under earlier regimes. But his words no longer carried authority. The court had chosen survival over restraint. The greenbacks were saved. Markets stabilized. Government credit recovered. The immediate crisis passed. But beneath the relief, a deeper problem remained unresolved. The court's justification relied heavily on war. Paper money, it said, was constitutional because the nation faced an emergency, because survival demanded flexibility, because extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary power. That raised a question no one could ignore. What happens when the emergency ends? The war was over. The Union was secure. Yet the greenbacks remained. They circulated alongside gold, a permanent reminder of a power that had been justified as temporary. America split along a familiar line. Farmers and laborers wanted more paper money. Inflation meant higher prices and easier deaths. Bankers and creditors wanted gold. Stability meant discipline and predictability. Money itself became political. Not taxes, not tariffs, the dollar. The economy surged and collapsed in cycles. Congress argued endlessly. And hovering over it all was the unanswered constitutional question the Supreme Court had carefully avoided. Was paper money a wartime weapon or a permanent feature of American government? For more than a decade, the court refused to answer, until it couldn't. In 1884, the issue returned, this time without any emergency to justify it. No war, no rebellion, no existential threat. Just an ordinary commercial dispute involving paper money issued long after the cannons had fallen silent. This was the moment of truth. If the court ruled against paper money now, it would admit that the government's monetary power evaporated with peace. If it ruled in favor, it would be declaring something far more radical, that the power to create money was permanent.
The decision was overwhelming. 8 justices ruled in favor of the government. Only 1 dissented. This time, the court did not rely on wartime necessity. It relied on sovereignty itself. The power to issue money, the court argued, was inherent to all governments. Kings possessed it. Empires possessed it. Parliaments possessed it. The United States was no different. The Constitution did not need to explicitly grant this authority. It was assumed. To deny it would be to deny the government's ability to function. In a single decision, the gold standard stopped being a constitutional requirement and became a policy choice. The lone dissenter issued a warning that read like prophecy. He argued that the power to create money was indistinguishable from the power to confiscate property, that once money was unmoored from something real, there would be no limit to abuse. Debts could be inflated away, savings quietly destroyed, political pain postponed at the expense of the future. But history had already chosen its direction. The industrial economy demanded liquidity. Railroads, factories, and global trade required flexibility. The discipline of metal was too rigid for a modernizing nation, and the Supreme Court had cleared the path. Money was no longer a limit on government. It was a tool. The Supreme Court's decisions did not collapse the economy. They did something far more enduring. They changed incentives. Before legal tender, money restrained the state. Gold and silver imposed discipline without speeches or laws. If the treasury was empty, it was empty. Governments could tax or borrow, but they could not easily escape the consequences of excess. Paper money changed that relationship. Once money became a legal construct rather than a physical one, scarcity became optional. And when scarcity became optional, so did restraint. The effects were not immediate. There was no overnight disaster, no hyperinflation, no collapse. Instead, something subtler happened, a slow expansion of what government could do without asking directly for payment. War could be financed without immediate taxation. Debt could be rolled forward instead of resolved. Political pain could be delayed and spread thin across time. Inflation became the quiet tax no one voted for. At first, it was modest, almost invisible, easy to ignore. But the precedent was now permanent. The Supreme Court had not merely legalized paper money, it had legalized flexibility. And flexibility, once granted, is never surrendered voluntarily. That power matured over decades. By the early 20th century, the United States had built a modern financial system on that foundation. Central banking emerged. Credit expanded. The economy grew faster than it ever had under metal alone. But the system still had one remaining constraint: gold. As long as dollars could ultimately be exchanged for metal, the government's power over money was powerful but not absolute. That final restraint would not survive the next crisis. In 1933, the United States faced an economic catastrophe unlike anything before it. Banks were failing, prices were falling, debt was crushing households and businesses. Deflation, not inflation, was the enemy. The president believed the system was breaking, and so he made a decision that would have been unthinkable before the legal tender cases. Gold ownership was outlawed. American citizens were ordered to surrender their gold coins and certificates in exchange for paper money. Contracts that promised payment in gold suddenly became obstacles to national policy. So Congress erased them. Every gold clause in private contracts was voided. Agreements written over decades were invalidated overnight. Creditors sued immediately, arguing that the government had crossed the final constitutional line. The cases reached the Supreme Court, and once again the court ruled for the government. The logic was familiar. If the state possessed sovereign authority over money, then no private contract could override it. Allowing citizens to demand gold would create a parallel monetary system, one beyond government control. That could not be permitted. The dissent was furious. One justice declared from the bench that the Constitution was gone, that property rights had been sacrificed for expediency, that the court had legalized confiscation in the name of survival. But the precedent held. The power born in the 1870s had fully matured. From that moment on, money in the United States was no longer anchored to anything outside government authority. Gold was reduced to a policy option, one that could be suspended, altered, or abandoned entirely.
When the final international link to gold was severed decades later, it was not a legal revolution. It was routine. The courts had already decided that the dollar was whatever the government said it was. Metal was optional. Law was not. What followed was not tyranny, but transformation. Money lost its physical body. It became entries in ledgers, numbers on screens, signals between institutions. Creation no longer required mines or presses, only authorization. The speed increased, the scale exploded. Trillions could be created with meetings and votes. Balance sheets expanded beyond anything imaginable to the judges who once argued over greenbacks and livestock. Yet the logic remained unchanged. Emergency justifies action. Action justifies power. Power redefines money. This pattern repeated across the 20th and 21st centuries. Wars, depressions, financial crises, pandemics. Each crisis expanded monetary authority a little further. Each expansion relied on the same legal foundation laid in the 19th century. The legal tender cases did not cause inflation. They created permission. Permission to borrow from the future. Permission to soften consequences. Permission to redefine promises. And permission, once granted, is rarely revoked. This is why debates about money feel emotional rather than technical. People sense the loss even when they cannot articulate it. They feel that something solid has been replaced with something negotiable, that promises no longer mean what they once did. And legally, they are correct. The dollar is not backed by metal, it is backed by authority, by courts, by enforcement, by belief that the system will still exist tomorrow. That belief has survived world wars, depressions, political crises, and financial shocks. It may survive many more, but for the first time since the 19th century, it faces competition, not from another nation, not from another currency, but from an idea, a form of money that does not ask permission, that does not rely on courts, presidents, or emergencies, that cannot be printed to solve a political problem. It is volatile, imperfect, young, but it represents something radical, a return to money as a rule, not a ruler. This brings the story full circle. Salmon P. Chase believed money should be anchored. He believed value should not bend with politics. History overruled him, not because he was wrong, but because the system chose survival over principle. The tragedy is not that paper money exists. The tragedy is that once the emergency passed, the power remained. Every generation since has lived inside that decision, benefited from it, paid for it, argued about it, and slowly adapted to a world where money is elastic, debt is permanent, and value is managed. The legal tender cases did not end the argument over money. They institutionalized one side of it. They declared that when survival is at stake, limits are optional, that law bends, that value can be declared into existence. And they were honest about it. There was no villain in this story, no single act of corruption, just rational decisions made under pressure, each one expanding what was possible until possibility became normal. Exception became precedent, precedent became permanent. That is how systems change, not through collapse, but through accommodation. When you hold $1 today, you are not holding a lie. You are holding a compromise, one forged in war, reinforced by courts, normalized by time. The sentence printed on that note is not a description, it is a command, and it tells you exactly who decides what your money is worth. There is a comforting myth we like to believe about money, that it is neutral, that it simply measures value without shaping behavior, that it is a passive tool, not an active force. The story of legal tender destroys that myth. Money is never just money. It is power, memory, and trust compressed into something we carry without thinking. When the Supreme Court legalized paper money, it did not announce a new era with fanfare. It did not declare the old world dead. It simply made survival easier than restraint. And that was enough. From that moment on, every crisis came with an escape hatch.
If taxes were unpopular, borrow. If borrowing became painful, inflate. If inflation became visible, rename it. Stimulus, liquidity, support. Each step felt reasonable. Each decision defensible. No single moment looked like betrayal. That is precisely why it worked. The most important consequences of the legal tender cases were not immediate. They unfolded slowly across generations. They changed what governments could promise and what citizens were expected to tolerate. Money stopped being a boundary. It became a tool. That tool has been used to fight wars, end depressions, stabilize banks, rescue markets, and soften political consequences. And to be clear, it has often worked. Entire systems might have collapsed without it. Millions of lives might have been ruined faster and more violently. That is the uncomfortable truth. The greenback saved the Union. Elastic money saved the banking system. Fiat bought time again and again. But time is never free. Every expansion of money shifts costs forward. It rewards those closest to creation and punishes those furthest from it. Savers feel it last. Wage earners feel it quietly. The erosion is gradual enough to normalize, slow enough to excuse, until it isn't. This is why arguments about inflation feel emotional rather than technical. People sense the loss even when they cannot articulate it. They feel that something solid has been replaced with something negotiable, that promises no longer mean what they used to mean. And legally, they are correct. The dollar is not backed by metal. It is backed by authority, by courts, by enforcement, by belief that the system will still exist tomorrow. That belief has survived world wars, depressions, financial crises, and political shocks. It may survive many more. But belief is not a law of nature. It is a psychological contract. And for the first time since the 19th century, that contract faces an alternative. Not from another nation, not from another central bank, but from an idea. A form of money that does not ask permission, that does not rely on courts, presidents, or emergencies, that cannot be printed to solve a political problem. It is volatile, imperfect, young, but it represents something radical, a return to money as a rule, not a ruler. This does not mean the old system will collapse. History is rarely that clean. More likely, the future will be defined by tension between flexibility and discipline, policy and principle, authority and rules. The same tension that began in 1862. The legal tender cases did not settle the debate over money. They institutionalized one side of it. They told the world that when survival is at stake, limits are optional, that law bends, that value can be declared, and they were honest about it. There was no villain twirling a mustache in this history, no single act of corruption, just rational decisions made under pressure, each one slightly expanding what was possible, until possibility became normal, until exception became precedent, until precedent became permanent. That is how systems change, not through collapse, but through accommodation. So when you hold $1 today, you are not holding a lie, you are holding a compromise, one forged in war, reinforced by courts, normalized by time. The men who made those decisions are gone. The war that justified them is long over. The justices' names are mostly forgotten. But the sentence they wrote still lives in your wallet. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That line is not a description, it is a command. It tells you that value is declared, not discovered, that money is enforced, not found, that survival once outweighed restraint, and the consequences of that choice never ended. The legal tender cases did not create inflation. They created permission. Permission to choose convenience over constraint. Permission to borrow from the future. Permission to redefine promises. And that permission has never been revoked. The question now is not whether legal money is legal. That was settled long ago. The question is whether a system built on declared value can endure indefinitely, or whether belief itself becomes the final constraint. Because when money is law, the strength of money is the strength of trust. And trust, unlike gold, is not mined. It is earned. And once lost, it is very hard to print back.